A warm welcome to tonight's archithese kontext-event. We are very happy to have Antón García-Abril as our guest tonight. In his lecture, he will present the work of Ensamble Studio. This evening is also the vernissage of the newest archithese, the December issue called Landart Erdarchitektur, and you will quickly understand why we had the urge to invite Anton to present the work of his office tonight. Thanks to all the authors and the architects who contributed to this newest issue. Thanks to the sponsors of this event, Blumer Lehmann, Janssen, Laufen and Ava. I share a passion for land art with most of my architect colleagues. But why? Is an appreciation of the sublime dramatic scenery. Our works of land art ideal surfaces for projecting hopes or utopias or perhaps focal points of romantic idealization. As a historian, I am fascinated by the immense temporal horizon addressed by these works of art, since their generally archaic appearance alludes to the earliest built structures of prehistoric humanity. The idea of the primeval hut is present everywhere in the architectural discourse. Yet it would at last be as important to speak of the primeval cave, for it is well known that natural depressions in the terrain offered the first habitation for people. And ever since a 176,000-year-old circle of stalactite was found in a French cave, we know that the oldest built structure of mankind is a piece of land art. But what does this have to do with contemporary architectural discourse? You might claim it's a sideshow. But the opposite is true. Land art is like a reflection of the fragility and inchoateness of architecture. It reveals the dependence on clients' external conditions and climatic and economic coincidences. So wrote Philipp Ursprung in the essay to the new archithese. And land art addresses the undoubtedly most central and oldest theme of architecture. How does a built object relate to the ground? Is it sufficient to just place it on the terrain, or should it be elevated above in a Corbusian manner? Or an analysis and current construction? Watching the current construction, there are shown many antitheses to these two approaches. There are a lot of new buildings in which little or no distinction whatsoever can be made between architecture and landscape, between the object and the ground. As editors of Archithese came across the work of Ensamble Studio for the first time at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. In the Arsenal, they showed superstructures versus structures. There's an X in the word, I cannot speak that properly. For us, it was the most exciting exhibit that year, especially the concrete structure that the team did for the Tippett Rice Art Center stayed in our mind. Concrete poured into depressions in the ground, tilted up and when dried or excavated, these ambivalent objects between seemingly geological objects and architecture turned into an initial spark for what would actually trigger the idea to make a thematic issue of archithese, of land art, and it's also the reason why we invited Anton to speak tonight. In a time where global architecture seems to become more flat and generic, the search for the specifics is at the rise at the same time. Mostly architects turn to the iconic, the analog, and the referential with a focus on architectural history, not Ensamble Studio. Their search for the specific is obvious, but they have a different focus. They try to extract the specific out of the character of the materials. When they deal with concrete, then you can feel within the object that the material is actually a liquid stone, liquid gotten into a hard material, a substance which wants to flow, which searches its way driven by gravity into the molds it can find. And at the same time, the objects, like the concrete, look like a geological incident. The same when they deal with steel as material for their projects. The possibility to withstand pressure and pulling forces is staged by huge spans, while the profiles tell a literally or real story of the profiles being mass-produced goods. That reminds strikingly of Louis Kahn, who asked with humor in one of his lectures, "Brick, what do you want to be?" And the brick answered, "I want to be part of an arch." It's important. So the Ensamble Studio is in this line of thinking to understand the nature of material, to know the potential, and to use them accordingly. So if the projects and designs of Ensemble seem radical, then they are radical in the sense of this word's origin, when it describes an approach which aims for the roots. It's a radicalism which shows the inherent potentials of materials. Let me give you some quick biographical notes about Antón García-Abril, and then I give the podium to him. He studied architecture at the Politécnica de Madrid and founded Ensamble Studio in the year 2000. Deborah Mesa joined 3 years later, and they're leading the team together since 2010. Currently, 19 architects work for Ensamble Studio in offices in Madrid and Boston. And Antón García-Abril teaches since 2012 at the MIT. Before, he was visiting professor at the University of Texas, Cornell University, and Harvard. And in the Pop Lab at the MIT, they're experimenting with new methods of prefabrication and other materials. But you will see more of that very soon. Anton, the stage is yours. Warm welcome. Give him an applause. Looking forward to it.
Well, thank you, dear friends from Archithese, for bringing me here. So I've prepared a set of videos that describe how we work. Not the ending product, not the result, not even static images of this. We are always interested in showing the making of, what's going on in between the idea and the building, and I think that's our job. I've been lecturing all my life a lecture called Stones and Beams are the two archetypical parts. Now I call it on-off. It's pretty much the same lecture. I always started with this small poem about our reaction to landscape and how, as Jörg was saying, we understand the relationship between matter, our prints in nature, and what could become part of it and what could be understood as architecture. So this is an early project that we did not really knowing what we were doing, just by removing and putting together everything that we found on the site, on the place, a beautiful cornice of the Atlantic, and putting together the existing matter, a bowl of soil just removed from the place, a volume constructed with hay bales, and we casted unreinforced concrete on it. We covered it, we contaminated this prefabricated chunk of matter, this stone, and we let it there, like cure. And we named it the truffle. The truffle almost as a parasite of nature, something that that grows informally attached to that savior, to that life that is part of nature. But it was not yet an architecture project. We let it there, rest for a while, not really knowing what we were going to obtain from. You can put a little bit more of music. And what we discovered was this, like, different lives of concrete. All these abrasive, viscous, very expressive material that was reacting to the cut that we had just done, even though we hadn't yet revealed the space. No? But we were already seeing all those encounters between architecture and landscape, all those age, all those wrinkles. We didn't have yet the tools to transform that. So we borrowed this cattle from our neighbor and help the process of carving out through the action of pushing, pretty much curating the animal into that space that's stable initially and for a long year, and making that long time, making that long event part of the fabule, part of the narrative of how slow and how sedimented all our actions should become when we deal with nature. And other aspects of the tectonics arose. We certainly discovered all this dirt accumulated through time, all these prints in various sides of this object, as part of the nature of how it was built. All this hairy concrete with very putrefacted matter encrusted on it. You could imagine a long layer of cow sheet taking care of the ground, and that beautiful printed vision of the sea that was facing. So all this soul of matter was very, very inspiring. So here we started to do the project once the building was built. So we tried to understand what was the logic between all these geometries that were given by the performance and the amount of control or of modularity that we had embedded into the system. And we made this analysis trying to comprehend all that crust, all that thickness, all that formations. Ultimately, how to embed this into a cultural project, and how could this be part of the culture of that place. You should imagine that corner, that Finisterrae was called by the Romans, as the end of their known world. That edge, that almost borderline to the unknown. How extraordinary that space is in the continental plaque of Spain. So all that content that is embedded into the place, into the landscape, into the culture, into the folk, was part of what we tried to incorporate into the history, the recent history of this little hut. All this like rusticated viscosity, warm and aged already, contrasted with this liquidity of the lintel, as a petrified sea that was above the habitable space. And in the exterior, that informality, that gave ultimately a figure to the truffle. So this project stayed in our hearts for a long time, and a decade after, in the other side of the world, and this is what makes architecture so fascinating. We had a call from a couple of fantastic allies that wanted us to do something in this extraordinary, untouched landscape close to the Rocky Mountains. In that place, these are called the Beartooth Mountains. This is where the continental and the Pacific plaque collides, and it's another edge situation. Is where the Rockies stop, and suddenly there's kind of a cloth of hills. As you can see, without a tree, without a reference, without anything but cattle and wildlife, but always with that mountain on the border. So we were asked to do an art center, and we declined that idea, saying that we couldn't incorporate any kind of referential building or human construct into that place. That would have ruined the experience of the program. That, by the way, was the contemplation of art, music experience, concerts, sculpture, but always in a special communion with the terrain, with the land. So we created a craft, a tectonic, and a language that had to be, we called it pre-architectural. We tried to avoid any kind of reference system, procedure that we had previously known. So all our actions, as you can see in this video, was to emulate the gestures of the geologies of the place, use the concrete as a very, very artificial conglomerate of all the soils, the crushed rocks, the pigmentation, but all done in a very wrong way, the anti-Swiss mode of doing concrete, no? Just breaking all the given rules, not mixing properly the cast, wrinkling the formwork, throwing the pigments, contaminating and giving, let's say, weaker resistance and not considering the thickness. And also reserving to this fabulous moment of unearthing, of birth, no? All that excitement of gravitatorial, I would say, initiatic moment, no? That slight contact, that crush, that connection, that arch is actually the portal, the entry, the door of the art center. The art center being a constellation of pieces that refer to each other as stones or as stars that were dropped there. So these situations of very primal equilibrium, informal and I would say raw, do create within the program the entries to that experiential or human world that was previously occupied by ranching and wildlife activities. No? So without being like very disruptive, we tried to immediately connect with I would say the primal souls of the place. No, these kind of totemic figures. We discovered that immediately connected to the very sophisticated art curators coming from New York and to the ranchers. There were something of those giving masses that true masses that were I would say, rooted to that place. But this is a building. This is a piece of architecture. This is not sculpture. These are rooms that have a program. There's a music festival, a very successful, recently organized music festival where chamber soloists perform to a very, very selected, I would say, audience that made the trip of the uncomfortable, let's say, journey just to have a new way of hearing music in communion with nature. So these kind of structures do operate as acoustical shells, and when we engineered the shell, we considered all this reflectivity, all those wrinkled surfaces, all these geometric proportions, try to use that resonator and use the rest of the landscape as, I would say, the auditorium. No? In these smaller spaces, the program is dramatized lectures of poetry or soloist concertos, sometimes duetos. There's a full argument, a full, I would say, sensibility that these pieces try to connect with very humane emotions that ultimately are those that art and especially music tries to express. So, going to the specifics of the material and trying to detect, as you can see, this inside of that stone takes all that abrasive magmatic condition, while the exterior or the other part does the contrary, provides that crystalline almost tightness. So this is the beauty of concrete as a conglomerate of all this materic and sensibilities of the material. So I want to flash back to my first early work. This was the first building that I did, even before founding Ensamble Studio with my actual partner, Deborah Mesa. But this is the origin of this sensibility. We were obliged to do this music school using granite in Santiago de Compostela. And by code, we were referred and obliged to maintain that compactness, volumetric. I don't remember all the set of rules, but they were like this. We just heard again to the stone and made this contraposition between this interior perfectly cut and shaped with diamond ropes, flamed surfaces that were contrasting, were narrating this richness of the material from the inside as a differential part to the outside that expressed and prevailed instead of the straight line, the blurry, the wrinkle, the surface, the aged materiality as a contemporary position. Or a second project that we did in the same plot, also in Santiago de Compostela, where our challenge was to go a little bit backwards within the culture of Santiago de Compostela that is well known since the early medieval ages. But there's an outstanding megalithical culture that goes from Galicia all the way to La Bretagne, with a lot of megalithical constructions that we want to honor. So we had the capacity to to somehow convince our historical commission that our look to history was longer than the city, but still part of the place. No? So we were wanted to make that connection between the megalithic tectonics and all its limitations by mass, weight, and cut of these pieces, and the contextual of the place. So everything starts with an explosion. No? I mean, it's really violent, and this is what makes so fabulous this destruction, where everything that we produce begins. No? So we wanted to go to that origin, to that Big Bang, no? To see how all these initial pieces that are obtained through explosion or through the first cuts, that are extremely raw, could be used as an immediate architectonic part. Of course, we didn't have laser scans or photogrammic techniques. This is pretty much 15 years ago. So we had to use it using the scientific method of try and error. So we started to understand how important was to be able to prefabricate something, to test it, to make it, to develop the technology, to develop the expressiveness, and ultimately to do the architecture project and the engineering. No? So everything that started in the quarry, where we pretty much moved all our practice for several months. I will never forget that experience, because we had to choose, identify, pretty much sketch rapidly and try to figure out where the center of masses were, more or less, so we could find a way to grab it with those chains, convince all these guys to use their tools in our behalf, not just to crush those stones or cut them, but to precisely locate them in the places and in the order that we were dreaming of, because again, we have not yet done the project. We had the license, we did something to serve the municipal government. It was blurry enough that we could pretty much do anything. And here is where we take use of the art world, because everything that is artistic is free. No? So that was, even though it's a structural wall, perfectly performative, and it weighs 1,000 tons, we could hide this structure under the idea of being a artistic facade, or I don't remember how we named it. The fact is that we started placing one stone after another, and that went out of control, and we actually built the full structure in the quarry. It was beautiful. We measured it, and I still remember when I called my engineer, and he came to the quarry. He says, "It looks pretty good, actually." But there was no way to anticipate the performance or the behavior of all of those stones that were placed there. Even though I always say that this is the most stable and safe structure I've ever built. Firstly, because I did it twice, and I could correct minor encounters. And the fact is that when we dismantled it to redo it on the site, and here we were also the contractors. I operated as GC, as general contractor here. I think it was the only way to be capable to do it. But we discovered that once we had placed those stones in the quarry, by signing with a red spray where those gravitatorial connections were happening, we really were able to rebuild it in a fraction of a time, in a very safe condition, in a very, it seemed like those stones had already found their place and they were comfortable in their position. And, but again, the ultimate idea is that all these chunks of matter redistributed and reorganized become part of the archetypical part. And now I'm in Menorca. Music, please. And this might be, I don't know, one of the last projects I do with this attitude. And this is the most radical, because in this case, I'm just not doing nothing. I had the fortune and the chance to find this beautiful abandoned mine in Menorca, and I just have to clean it and use the technology not to ruin it. And find a program, by the way, because I know I love it, I want to use it, but I don't know what to do with it. So we started this by inserting light and air, no? As this first stone, this ceremonial moment of birth of architecture. We did all this event of chopping a stone from the lintel of the quarry with a little tree and olive that arrived almost dead. But we put it vertically, and through this oculus that has 9 meters deep into that gut of the terrain, we understand this is the first stone, that the keystone of the equilibrium of all that given fruit of the earth. The rest of the project was 3D scanned. Look at these beautiful drawings. I would love to say that these come from my, gifted hand of representation, but they're just the 3D scans. No? So this opens another reflection about representation. What was the role of architects? How we can use the technology to express an architectonical idea. In this case, just by 3D scanning with laser all those guts, printing them to discover the geometries, the cloud point of that space, and the existing space. We thought that the architecture project was just by revealing it, and transform that into architecture just by saying it. Now we are doing. When I mean now, I mean that I was doing it yesterday. So not this part, but what you're going to see in the last. But I think it's a non-edited video that I produced rapidly. But I think it was interesting to understand our vision of the architecture of the earth. This is an installation. Installation is an hybrid between an art piece and an architecture construct that we were commissioned to celebrate a big exhibition that's going to be held in New York, in the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum, about nature. So they told us to do something in the beautiful garden that they have in front of Central Park. So what we presented, and they accepted it. He said that we were going to prefabricate a river that we knew that before architecture came to Manhattan and we gridded everything and we flattened and we have that beautiful and amazing city that we all love. Before, the island was full of hills, rivers, and a lot of natural beauty that was not erased it's there, it's kept, it's hidden, souterrain. So we're going to lift it, and we're going to fabricate this metaphor into a massive concrete structure. So that river, this is all I would say the sketching process where we produce a lot of rivers, and some of them were structural, some of them were part of the standing point. So all these traces of structure, these beams, are performative like any other structure. In the meanwhile, we were commissioned to do a little passerelle in China. So we used this same idea to create a bridge that was not jumping from street to street, it was part of the river. So this bridge was designed through all those traces, and we faced here a dilemma, is that we loved them all. We didn't care which fluidity was part of that building, that structure. Understanding that when that concept is clear or knitted enough, the formal aspects of it are pretty much irrelevant. I think this is something that is very, very surprising. It's like if you look at stone, and another stone, there's no formal preferences. So after all this back and forth from a conceptual part to a more urbanistical relationship with the landscape, now we are abstracted, and these are images of last week, pretty much, where we did the prototype. It's not the real structure, but we did a prototype, and the prototype is in scale, I would say, 1:2. So we will build another of these petrified rivers for the museum, but we wanted to rehearse it, to test it, not only mechanically but also the materiality. So as you can see, everything departs from the terrain with small preparation, a lot of uncertainty, and this is the contradiction, how the formal and I would say metamorphical uncertainty that is given by the fluidity of the concrete when you let it loose has to be combined with a total precision of where those tensions travel through the guts, the reinforcement. So the combination of what you leave as freedom and what you control as the driver of that freedom is what we were working. So we decided to make a very simple differentiation. We were going to fully control the reinforcement and leave the liquid part of the composite beam pretty much flow and create that beautiful and poetic form. The specific characteristics of this technique is just controlling with a little bit of extra sensibility the plasticity of concrete. So we just add more fluidificant or more water, depending on which part we want it looser or straighter, or just to maintain it, and the amount of vibration. So somehow we are working with that forces that we apply constantly to matter, to try to depict with them the ultimate appearance of the project. Again, we want that contrast between the part of the river that is unearthed and the part of the river that is pressurized, fluid and liquid, and crystalline. These two natures that we firstly worked out in the little truffle, again in the structure of landscape Montana. Here is revealed as a very intrinsic part of the expression of this piece. No? Dangerous stuff. These 22 tones became a structural beam that worked out very well in the deformation tests, like any kind of architecture structures. But formally, it had this kind of appearance, this kind of abrupt and very expressive face, surface, where we could ultimately create that landscape, an onirical scale landscape, and also that I would say stiffness enough to fly and to be kind of unveiled over the existing soil. The other piece where the river flows is to a lake, a pond, or the sea. So we are creating a big vase, almost like a Baroque fontanone, no? Where all that water and all that inertia and all the equilibrium of this long structural trace parts. But this structure that we casted last week, it has a very important engineering prefabrication skill. Is that it's pretty much it will fit in the middle of this auditorium, a little bit smaller, but it has to be transported to New York. So we're using prefabrication techniques of breaking that vase into parts to be able to reassemble them. Like in any building, the difference is that while in buildings we love to distinguish the parts or disvanish them with a unseen joint. In this case, we wanted that joint to be a wrinkle, and making that match of the liquid wrinkle part of the argument. So the prefabrication is independent of the formality of the building. This is a theater that we built in Mexico City, where the nature of the assembly, the prefabrication of the parts, was also part of the tectonical logic and the form. We wanted to create another stone. In this case, we call it, in Spanish, la piedra del sol, the sunstone, la dovela, la clave. These are very, very metaphorical visions of Mesoamerican Azteca culture, no? Of almost sacred pieces of their imaginarium, no? That relates the sun as a stone to the figures that we create as humans as stones. So I wanted this capacity of the sun, the light, and the gravity to be combined in a special way that you could feel all these presences. It's just a structure that levitates over a big hole in the ground. So everything was the equilibrium of a big excavation that held the black box of the theater, and that levitating stone combined with this bidirectional steel plates that would operate as as a very symbolical figure that could represent the existence of that hidden gem, that space that is totally excavated. No? So we built all this excavation with everything covered, and one day we just opened, and most of the people that were in the rest of the buildings didn't realize what was going inside. No, that was a very interesting moment. No? As you can see, this dovela operates with its deformations over the 4 columns that hide into their form, their deformation, and their position. They hide their gravitatorial consistency, no? And that's why, let's say, all the gravitas, all the weight, and the distinguished light that becomes part of the matter of the stone, not as a projected light, no? Is what makes that construct of the dovela interesting. In the point of view of the place, of the city, this little building was surrounded by huge towers and museums and big buildings. So we wanted to make a very, very silent, 5-meter high canopy where the presence of space was defying the formal monumentality of the neighbors. And in parallel to these last projects, we were building a house, the Meroscopian house, where we wanted to celebrate this logic of prefabrication to the ultimate case. So we just went to a catalog, off-the-shelf civil engineering, I-beams, slabs, vaulted artesas, I don't know how to say in English, this beam. And we just reorganized them in an unprecedented way. Again, differentiating between its formal conditions, the I-beam, the U, the slab, with the pretension and the post-tensioning connections that were all, as you could imagine, fully custom. So, but I wanted again to detach the performance, the stresses that go and flow through the guts of those forms within its form. No? And I think this is what concrete offers us, no? This versatility of operations, of performance. No? In terms of the formal aspects of each of these pieces, we're just interested in creating a gravitatorial itinerary, an helicoidal transit of that transmission of gravitas to create a certain space that was balanced by the action of those heavy presences, those heavy traces of those beams that were defining a space without enclosing it, a courtyard house in this case. And ultimately, what we were, again, surprised is how the space became extraordinarily light and transparent and fluid, even though it was constructed by these very, very heavy pieces. Heavy and pretty much soulless pieces, no? How indifferent is the form of an I-beam to the rest, no? Even though it was designed like that way to really perform efficiently, no? But it becomes part of a cornice, no? It becomes part of a facade. Suddenly the beam is not a beam anymore, it's part of a wall. So it acquires a different significance just by participating in that conglomerate of pieces just by being incorporated to a system and just by detonating that spatiality. No? That spatiality that was cut, no? That itinerary of gravity was counterbalanced by that keystone. Again, the same word with different meanings. No? That keystone that we call it the G-spot, no? That is perfectly located and closes the balance of the structure. And that was a gift of the quarry guy. No? And this is the result, the transparency, that integration of those traces to the wrinkles of the landscape. No? Is the reversal of what we tried with the truffle, no? Where all the space was wrinkled and the landscape was providing the single line. No? So I think these dualities between geometries, masses, and forms is what become part of the architecture discourse. After doing this house, we had the chance to do a historical transformation of a slaughterhouse into a mediatheque. And this building was fully protected by municipal government, untouchable. So the only thing that we could do was like solve the hygiene of the walls, incorporate MEPs. But by doing this kind of celebration of the engineering, we could convince everybody that all these pieces were part of the mobile, of the furnishing of the house. Something that you inserted through the door or through the window. So it was accepted, and even though each of those weighed 50 tons and they have an independent structure, but they were part of that mobile tectonic. No? It came up, it was inserted, almost sneaking into that space, no? Not becoming part of it, not touching it. No? So here we learned another lesson about the structure. No? Structure of a building doesn't have to support anything. No? It has to contain. It has to add order. It has to provoke that kind of dissonance through its presence. No? This is the kind of exercise that we produce here. No? We inserted into that system this very impure, almost unprecedented part that pretty much contradicted all the existing structure. No? The collision between the fragility of that metal structure, the trusses, no? The order, the vertical, almost a basilical space, being contradicted or sometimes defied by those, let's say, transversal and horizontal traces that didn't touch each other, but they operate simultaneously as a sole structure. I think this is the most surprising part of this project. No? This collide, this encounter of these two artifacts that don't recognize each other, don't touch each other, don't even respond to each other, but they were working as a unit. No? And all this could be again done through the development of these prefabrication techniques. No? So we have to use the craft of the engineering and the logics of the offsite to respond to our ideals. And I think this project does respond properly, no? by inserting and doing all this kind of engineering effort just to introduce his structural parts into the core of an historical building. And by doing that, the transformation was integral, and the basilical slaughterhouse never felt again as that industrial building. Suddenly, the space had been extraordinarily reinterpreted. And I think this is one of the most important goals of architecture in these interventions in existing buildings that do have a history and do have a past that is sometimes difficult to transform. This compound of slaughterhouses in the center of Madrid, in Matadero, now is part of a cultural network of emerging art and initiatives, younger initiatives that used this pretty much residual infrastructure, but required a total reinterpretation and transformation. So all these buildings that I've showed you occurred before, except the ones in Montana. But this before I went to the United States, to the MIT, to found a lab called the POP Lab, Prototypes of Prefabrication. And this occurred like 5 years ago when I moved there, and I had already been researching all my career, so the idea of starting research was kind of unpleasant. So what I did was to continue the research, but challenge everything that I had done before as a mental exercise. So I started building these I-beams, colossal big I-beams, but they didn't have the mass. They did produce the same weight in terms of the space, the presence, the trace, but they were lacking of the mass. They were, instead of being pre-stressed concrete, was post-tension foam. The same, I said, okay, let's try to do a construct like the ones that we did in Santiago Compostela with those like heavy lifting stones, some of them close to 30 and 40 tons. Let's do that with these blocks of pretty much air, foam, pretty much like a model. So we could pretty much carry them, and because I wanted to experience the idea that intellectually I had been following, but I wanted to see the empirical evidence that architects, sometimes we confuse the terminology of weight as a force or weight as a mass. And what really interests us architects is the weight as a force, because that's the one that detonates the spatial experience. The mass per se is a characteristic inherent of matter that could only be experienced on the bascule. So we kind of enjoyed the lack of mass. Still wanted the firmitas, the weight, the presence, the cyclopean. So I spinned off the research immediately. I'm that kind of academic that I cannot be in the academia too much. And I went back to Madrid, opened shop. Even though it was with some of my students, we decided to build a house immediately ready to be built. With an outstanding challenge is that I wanted to build it in Madrid and ship it to the United States. So the prefabricability had to be fitting the transportation networks, had to be light, had to be strongly insulated, it had to be performative, it had to be up to code, it had to be a piece of architecture that was going to be erected above an existing garage. So it was, I would say, a la carte technology that had to respond to our Deborah and myself, our idearium of let's find architecture that has no mass but all contains all the weight. And it's capable to be flat packed and transported overseas. That was a challenge. So we built it. It's actually our office in Madrid, in Boston, excuse me. And as you can see, it settles above an existing structure, so lightness helps very much. And we had to develop this encounter of traditions. Here we put together the tectonics that we love in Europe, the big pieces, the prefabrication, etc., with the logic of the Anglo-Saxon systemic 4x8 panelized system. And we built this kind of multi-purpose space that serves as office and as family room, as extension of our living space that is below in the garage. But this is our ground zero of what we're working now, because this opened our eyes and the appetite of some business investors who understood that all the industry of construction in the United States is moving to prefabrication. It's merging to offsite. Buildings are not taking advantage of any of the tools that we have available. I'm talking about advanced manufacturing, robotics, this kind of matter-to-data connections, things that we do continuously in our labs, but the industry is not yet ready. So we started to be prepared to this wave that might impact especially architecture design as it is today and engineering. And we are actually building an Ensamble Fabrica as the factorial lab in a bigger scale, where we started to redevelop all the pieces and parts that we had done for our house. I cannot disclose all the ticks because I would have to kill you all, but the fact is that the technology is pretty much taking advantage of two traditions: the European, where we do buildings in concrete, and the North American, where buildings are framed in light stud material. So if we put this together, we understood that walls, beams, and slabs could be engineered taking advantage of all the manufacturing, robotics, prefabrication parts, and lightness. This is the key part, containing all the different parts of the building except the liquid of the concrete. So I'm dissociating again the performative part of the concrete structure and the conglomerate. In other words, this is the demonstration, and I wanted to do this by prefabricating with this technology la unité d'habitation. And as you can see, it's pretty much this. And this is kind of the anti-domino house. We've been obliged to do the bones of the building, the first thing, the domino, and after you fulfill it with other parts. In this case, what we're doing is exactly the contrary. The first thing that we do is all the building, layer by layer, except the domino that is injected in the last minute and ultimately provides the performative stiffness of a concrete building. So this has taken us to the point where we are now working to develop a lot of structures that we had never done before to serve a research and entrepreneurial commission, where architecture is fully flat-packed, pre-manufactured in ultra-lightness off-site that could be also transported not only by flatbed trucks, but that could be inserted in a container. And this suddenly opens the marketplace worldwide. And that, once it's assembled, it contains the stiffness of the most universal and available of our materials, that is concrete. So to do this, we are these are also pretty recent images. We're now under construction of this new understanding of what a studio is. What I've learned by being in MIT is that the practice of being an architect is challenged. Maybe here in Switzerland or in Spain, we still enjoy the pleasures of being an architect as a master builder, where you have the conversation open about engineering, about craft, and the interactions with the construction place. This as you all know, of course, but the rest of the world is very difficult. The architect is kind of a designer that does some drawings and leaves them apart to do others. And what I've showed you in my early 21st years of career, we were the builder. We were the master builder of all our buildings. That's what we enjoy the most. So now we understand that to maintain that condition, we have to take extensive use of the capabilities of technology and try to connect the data, that is the project, the idea, even money is data, to matter. Shortcutting everything that we have in between, the contractor, the subcontractor, the executor, And I think this connection is possible and is how I anticipate could transform how we understand today the practice of designing and executing the construction of a building. This connection, driven by technology, not only through the engineering and design process that we are already there, but creating that connections to the parts that do fabricate all these elements, is what I think will make the big transformation. Here is what we are doing with our technology. This very light, but self-supporting, cold-molded trusses. That's a 20-meter span truss. That is either injected the concrete when it's already outstanding above with some shoring, or could be done in a traditional way, cast it in place and lifted today. But it could be prefabricated offsite. In this case, we're doing it. All this construction, we're doing it ourselves. That's why it's taking us so much time and effort, because we are. I mean, everybody that you see there are part of the Ensamble Studio. We're not working with contractors, because the next phase of this project is to upscale this to a greater, let's say, typology of high-rise or mid-rises that we are now designing, that is just extending the usage of these logics of lightness versus weight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. I'm a little bit speechless by the power and poetry of these images, but maybe the audience is not as speechless as I. I want to open for questions.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I was really amazed how much you spent in the pre-process and how much you think about how the buildings are constructed. Do you give so much thought also about like the life cycle of the buildings and like how your materials will live on? Because it's nowadays quite an issue, the reusability and recyclability of buildings. And is that a thing that you think about?
Yeah. I do think about it. Yeah. I'm thinking a little bit more right now about it. The life of a building, I'm thinking that you are meaning the durability or the maintenance. No? Maybe I think more the life of the building in a poetic or cultural point of view. I think that the truffle, for example, has had so far a long life, and hopefully will have a longer life because it's part of some thoughts of other architects that are thinking about architecture not as a high resolution materic process. No, suddenly it opened the appetite and the idea of a building being constructed with a very rough, abrasive, low-resolution informality. And that elongs its life, There are a lot of buildings that might durate a lot in years and might be extinct culturally the same moment that they're finished. So this is another kind of durability that I'm preoccupied on. To say this, the truffle has all kinds of pathologies. The water comes in several moments. There's wildlife inside, When I go there every year, I have to disinfect it pretty much, no? Is that a failure? No, it's circumstantial. It's part of the game, no? Other buildings do have to last, and they have to resist time. They have to have a lifetime because they are public buildings, the schools or the mediatheks. I'm a responsible architect, even though I might not look like, but I do. And the best responsibility I have in my buildings is that I build them as a contractor, so I have like the decennial liability. So I think it's very important to understand these two lives of a building. The physical and the cultural one.
Now for something completely different. I was noticing that you were also composing the music to your...
No.
Is that
That's my dad.
Oh, that's your dad.
That's my dad. Ah. I would love to be able to compose the music. No, I do videos. And videos need music. Unfortunately, we didn't hear the music today because I was not controlling the volume. But as you can see, I have not presented you plans or constructive details because I think that there's something beyond the technology that I'm so interested at, and actually everything that you've seen here is a technological challenge. And the substrate, the spaces, I would say the architecture is the consequence, no, is what comes up, no. But everything starts with I would say a story that I like to document myself. I learned a little bit late. But I totally recommend it to all my students and to everybody that this is not about the Instagram era. I've been doing it forever. It's about the scientific method. It's about documenting all the process to be able to share it, to be able to remember it, and to reuse it. Because I don't know if it was clear, but even though the expressions of the buildings or the technologies are so distinct, I think there's a narrative of the usage of materials, the dissociation of the performance versus the form that is a continuum in all the projects. No? So all this narrative, all this story, I want to illustrate it always with a video, and a video without music has no sense.
Okay, well, one more question maybe?
A practical question. Can you say something about the engineering or the process of the engineer concerning the project outside Madrid? I don't remember the name of the house, but the crazy, fantastic house that has a stone on top.
Yeah, the engineering.
Well, sorry, because I guess in that case it can't be trial and error. There has to be some sort of...
Well, the engineering, we did a double engineering. First with our in-house engineer, and I say in-house because we've always engineered ourselves the first equilibrium, no? As a very simple exercises of forces. Because we love the idea of incorporate the engineering as as oxygen to breathe into the architectural process, not as a service that somebody adds. No? So, to tell you a side story, and I'll go back to your question, when we arrived to the United States, I couldn't have a conversation about engineering with my clients because I was the architect, and architects don't talk about engineering, and I was so frustrated that I changed the name of my company. And Ensamble Studio has been forever. We had a motto that says architecture, practice, research and education in architecture. And we've added an architecture and engineering. And suddenly we are an engineering firm. And we can have a conversation without insulting anybody. Another side letter that I learned about the engineering is that when we did the project in Montana, we did all the engineering ourselves, calculate of, the most difficult one was to find the center of gravity, where to pins, how to rebalance the maneuver of the cranes. I mean, we engineered all that for the protocol of construction, and after we needed a stamp, so we hired, actually the client hired an engineer, a local engineer that would stamp it. No? One day we realized that this guy presented the project that he had not engineered to the National Award of Structural Engineering, and he got it, you know? So I called him and said, hey, Matt, let's share the prize at least, no? No, but you're the architect. But this project is called Structures of Landscape. It's a structure. There's no difference between the engineering and well, there's a professional kind of weakness in the Anglo-Saxon world that engineering is provided by the engineer and the architect has not even a word on it, okay, because of the liabilities and this stuff. So, said this, this is where we are now. How we started with this house and with these first projects, the engineering was so absurdly distinct to the standard service that we had to find a way to do it ourselves. So we hired a guy that his name is Jesus. It's very important because every time we had a question, we say, let's ask Jesus. No? So we put it kind of in a religious level. So Jesus has a master class to all the ensemble every Wednesday, since almost pretty much 20 years. So we do our engineering, but Jesus validates our data. In the case of the Meroskopian house that you ask, it was a very simple forces exercises because all the pieces were pretty much independently weighed and it was kind of the easy part. And after we delivered to the pre-manufacturer, to the precaster, who had its own engineering, let's say, team, and they did all the pre-stress, post-tensioning, the connections that we were not experts in, because each of those pieces are pre-stressed and post-tensioned, and all those connections are kind of different. Some of them are just static apoyos, I would say. Some of them are articulated, you know. So, yeah, it was kind of a combination. It starts in our side, but we always rely in a deeper voice, just to match and to check. You know? We like we like very much this to do the engineering ourselves.
Okay. Give a big applause to Anton. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, dass ihr heute da wart. Auch nochmal danke an die Sponsoren. Es ist, finde ich, besonders schön, wenn man hier wie mit Bluma Lehmann, Jansen, Laufen, AVA Firmen hat, die genau an diesen Themen arbeiten, die aus den Materialien, an den Materialien arbeiten, an den Konstruktionen arbeiten, dass es da einen Dialog gibt. Danke auch nochmal für das Engagement. Wenn ihr rausgeht, macht einen Zwischenstopp an dem Tisch. Da gibt es natürlich die neue Archithese. Es ist ein Interview drin mit Ensamble Studio, von Elias Baumgarten, natürlich viele andere Geschichten, die mit diesen Themen, die wir heute besprochen haben, im Bezug stehen. Also 1000 Dank, dass Sie und ihr heute da wart und hoffentlich bis ganz bald und einen schönen Abend.